Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
In late November, the last mycorrhizal genus to send up mushrooms associates with hickories, and that is the genus Hygrophorus. Woodwax is the common name for that genus, so this would be the salmon-colored woodwax. Hygrophorus subsalmonius. This could be a species complex, and there are several lookalikes that closely resemble it, but I believe Hygrophorus subsalmonius, they all have one thing in common in that they have this thick slime cuticle coating them, and I think that probably has something, it acts as sort of an antifreeze, and the genus derives its name from that coating of slime. They are hard to spot. They come up underneath the fallen leaves. One of the more rare and unusual species to find in the very late season. The rest of this video is an art lesson for my two youngest nieces. Let's put down a line that might represent the edge of a table, or perhaps a platform, or maybe a horizon. And we'll put down a second line parallel to the first, and then a line that intersects both of the previous lines, and then a vertical line like so. These lines represent the three spatial dimensions: height, width, and depth. But perhaps you can see the problem already. We're trying to depict three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface, a flat sheet of paper. So one of the dimensions is an illusion, one is fake. And of course it's the axis labeled y, the y dimension, or the depth dimension, is the one that is illusory. The x-axis represents the real dimension of width. Your paper has real width. And the z-axis represents real height. Your paper has a dimension of height. But the y-axis, of course, being the dimension of depth, is the illusion. Now here you can see I've divided the axes into units of equal length. But of course the y-axis, the units appear to be closer together as it recedes into the illusory distance. But that's a phenomenon you'll already be familiar with if you've ever observed fence posts or power line posts along the side of a road. So let's put down a circle, and this is of course in reality a flat two-dimensional circle. But we're going to treat it as if it were a sphere, as if it were three-dimensional. And the way we're going to do that is with shading and shadow. So if our imaginary light source is directly above the imaginary sphere, then the light source will not be able to directly illuminate the sphere, beginning at the point where it curves under, where it begins to turn away from the light source. Beginning there and further down, the sphere will be shaded, and it will cast a shadow onto the table that roughly approximates a line from the light source to the edge of the sphere and then down to the table, like so. Whoops, we need to extend the shadow out a bit further on this side. Now, at the bottom of the sphere, and where the shadow is also close to the bottom of the sphere, it's going to be a little bit darker. And this is called ambient occlusion, because ambient light from the light source can reflect off of the table and illuminate the upper part of the shaded area. But as it begins to turn under more and more, it becomes harder for that ambient light to bounce in there and illuminate that part. So it becomes darker and darker as you get closer to where the sphere touches the table. And the same is true of the cast shadow. Then that is called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is an important concept because it's edges and transitions in ambient occlusion that allow us to take an image in the real world and abstract it into lines that we can work with in our minds. In other words, ambient occlusion is one of the things that allows us to create sketches and cartoons. So now, what if the light source is behind the sphere? Or in other words, what if the sphere is between the viewer and the light source? In that case, the shaded area will look like this, and the shadow will be cast toward the viewer, or in other words, away from the light source. And once again, we'll add some ambient occlusion and some darkening where the sphere touches the table. Well, what if the light source is on the same side of the x-axis as the viewer? In that case, the shaded area will look like this, and the shadow will be cast away from the light source and the viewer. Now there would also be a highlight on the sphere, and what that would look like would depend on the material that we're trying to say the sphere is made of, whether it's shiny or dull or reflective or metallic and so forth. But we'll discuss highlights in another video. For now, we're just going to concentrate on shading and shadow, and how sharp or fuzzy the shadow is will depend on the nature of the light source, whether it's the sun diffusing through clouds or through curtains or something like that. But in this case, we're just going to assume an unfiltered light source casting sharp shadows. So let's do a different exercise. Let's do 2 circles, and within one of those circles we'll create a smaller circle, and then this little Y shape with a little split at the bottom. Now in this case we can decide whether we want to draw a happy cat or a grumpy cat. The lower lines like that would make a grumpy cat, because this is the muzzle of a cat's face that we're cartooning here. But if we have the curved up lines, then that's going to be a little bit happier cat. Here we can add the whiskers to make it a little more apparent that we're drawing the muzzle of a cat. And then of course we'll add the eyes. They have the more vertical sort of pupils as opposed to the round pupils that humans have. So we'll get those sketched in, clean those up just a little bit here. Now on the other side, the other circle, well, first of all, let's say our light source is directly above this floating cat head. And you might ask, well, Uncle Scrawny, why would there be a floating cat head? Well, you'll just have to ask Alice about that. But in the meantime, we'll make a side view on the other circle with a little muzzle that sticks out, and we'll add some whiskers there. Now again, the light source is directly above it, so the shadow line, based on our previous exercise with the sphere, is going to fall something like this. Below that is what will be shaded, and right above the eye, where it begins to turn in a little bit, that will be shaded as well on the lower side of the eyeball, because it's a sphere. That will have a shadow as well. And of course the ears will cast a shadow onto the rest of the face. On this other side we'll do the same thing. We'll have those little shaded areas where the eye sockets begin to turn in, some shadows for the ears as they're facing down, and then right where the edge of the face begins to turn under, that will be in shadow. That will be shaded, and down below there will be shaded. So there we have our shaded floating cat heads. So let's run through that whole exercise again. I'll just be quiet so you can watch carefully, and again we're just going to say that the light source is directly above the figures. So watch carefully. So now, what if the light source is right beside the figures? And what if there were a wall? What if there were a white wall that reflected ambient light back onto the shaded side of the face? What would that look like? Well, let's set ourselves up with another floating cat head, and we'll put our light source right there, right beside the head, but a little bit above. Now you can see the eyes aren't level and the face isn't symmetrical, so maybe in the next video we'll discuss the Loomis method and how to keep things that are supposed to be symmetrical, and things that are supposed to be level, well, how to keep them level. But in the meantime, here's our white wall. The ambient light will be bouncing off of that onto the shaded side of the cat's face. And of course it will cast a shadow on that wall, so let's go ahead and fill that shadow in. So the shaded line, and of course the ears will cast a shadow away from the light source, and the shading line will fall about right through there. But because of that ambient reflection, the shaded line is going to be darkest right by the line itself. It's going to be darkest where it's closest to the highlight. But as you get closer to the wall, that ambient light begins to reflect in and it becomes lighter. So it's darkest right at the edge of the shaded part, and it gets lighter as you proceed further. So it's the opposite of ambient occlusion. It's ambient reflection. So, but you've heard me say already that ambient occlusion is partly what allows us to create abstract drawings, to create cartoons out of things that exist in the real world. And I'm going to demonstrate that principle by reversing the process. Here we're taking a cartoon and we're smoothing out the lines, blurring it up, fuzzying it up a bit, and we'll wind up with something that looks a lot more like a real cat. So we've reversed the process of cartooning. We've gone from lines and just softened them out into something that looks closer to what actually exists in the real world. And so in the next video, like we said, let's cover the Loomis method. We'll just do a partial exploration of the Loomis method, not the full thing. How to keep eyes and noses and things like that symmetrical. And perhaps we'll also get into breaking down the pictorial space into layers. We were talking about dimensions, the illusory dimension in this episode, so maybe we'll talk about layers, and it depends on the sort of media you're using. So we'll get into layers and media and sketches and things like that in the next episode. And in the meantime, you can draw some spheres and some floating cat heads and shade them with the light source in different positions, and just see what you come up with and try different things like that. So we'll see you on the next episode.